She was not supposed to rise. A child thrown into humiliation, trained in cruelty, and marked forever by practices Rome itself had outlawed, Theodora should have been erased by history. Instead, she turned degradation into mastery, turning men's weaknesses into stepping stones, and blood-soaked arenas into her throne room. To some, she was a savior of women. To others, a ruthless predator cloaked in purple. Her life forces us to face a brutal paradox. The same horrors that destroy countless lives also created an empress who could not be broken. And that is why her story still horrifies and fascinates. Rome is often remembered for its brutal gladiator games and violent arenas, yet even in that culture of blood sport there were lines that could not be crossed. Certain sexual performances involving children and animals were seen as so degrading that Roman law refused to allow them. What Rome rejected, however, was not erased from history. When power shifted to Byzantium, these same practices were not only tolerated but became part of the city's entertainment system. In Constantinople, the Hippodrome was not just a place for chariot races. It became a theater where humiliation and abuse were turned into spectacles for massive crowds. What had once been unthinkable in the heart of the empire was now normalized as nightly amusement. The paradox is striking. A society that inherited Rome's legacy also embraced rituals Rome itself considered too extreme. But out of this cruelty, a 10-year-old girl would rise, only to turn that horror into empire-shaping vengeance. In Constantinople, daily life was dominated by two massive factions known as the Blues and the Greens. On the surface they looked like circus supporters cheering for their chariot teams, but in reality they worked more like political machines. Each faction controlled jobs, distributed favors, and offered protection to those loyal to their colors. Belonging to one side shaped a person's identity and even determined their chance of survival. A craftsman, performer, or animal keeper held his position only because the faction allowed it. If support was withdrawn, the family tied to him could quickly lose income, status, and security. In this system, loyalty was less about sport and more about life itself. For Theodora's family, everything depended on their father's official role as the bearkeeper for the Greens. That position meant steady food and safety, and without it they were exposed to poverty. And when one corrupt bribe snatched away her father's job, the path into exploitation opened instantly. Acacius, the bearkeeper of the Greens, died suddenly, leaving his wife and 3 young daughters behind. According to custom, his position should have passed to one of his children so that the family would not be left without support. It was a safeguard meant to prevent widows and orphans from immediate ruin. But in practice, corruption often overpowered tradition. The official responsible for confirming the inheritance, a dancing master named Asterius, saw an opportunity. Instead of honoring the rule, he accepted a bribe and sold the position to another man. Overnight, the family's security vanished. The Greens no longer owed them protection, and their connection to the Hippodrome evaporated. What should have been a steady future collapsed into uncertainty. The widow had no powerful allies, no property, and no relatives willing to help. 3 daughters now looked to her for survival, but the city had no mercy for the powerless. With no bread, no allies, and 3 daughters, the mother had only one door left, and it led straight into Constantinople's darkest industry. The Hippodrome was the beating heart of Constantinople, a place where politics and entertainment merged into one. Chariot races stirred riots, emperors appeared before the crowd, and faction leaders controlled the streets through their followers. But hidden within this public arena was another trade just as influential: the market of flesh. Actresses were legally defined as prostitutes, meaning any girl who performed on stage was automatically marked for sexual use. There was no distinction between theater and brothel, no right to refuse, and no hope of protection under the law. Families ruined by poverty often brought their daughters here to beg or to be noticed by men willing to pay for them. Public rituals of humiliation were common, where children were paraded to stir pity, only to be recruited into lives of exploitation. For Theodora and her sisters, this was the environment forced upon them once their father's position was lost. Among the 3 sisters, one child stood out, not for beauty yet, but for the cold way she watched men's weaknesses. Among the most disturbing spectacles of the Byzantine stage was a performance known as Leda and the Swan. Based on a myth from antiquity, it was transformed into a live act where trained animals were forced to interact with young performers in ways meant to shock and amuse the crowd. What had been a poetic story in Greek art was turned into an obscene display in Constantinople. Audiences did not look away in disgust. Instead, they laughed, jeered, and applauded, treating such scenes as common entertainment. The normalization of these acts stripped children of dignity and reinforced the idea that performers were nothing more than property for pleasure. Theodora, still only a girl, became closely associated with this performance. She perfected the act and used it to stand out from other entertainers, gaining both fame and infamy in the Hippodrome's underground world. Yet while the crowd saw only spectacle, she was learning something far more valuable. But the real lessons weren't on stage. They were in the back rooms, where senators revealed far more than just money. Theodora's survival depended on more than performing. It depended on observation. Every encounter with powerful men offered her insight into how they thought, what they feared, and what desires ruled their choices. She noticed that even the most respected senators carried private shame, that generals who commanded armies trembled when their secrets were threatened, and that wealthy patrons could be led by nothing more than flattery or ridicule. Rather than seeing these moments only as abuse, she began treating them as lessons. Each humiliation became a study session in human weakness, each transaction a chance to expand her understanding of influence. Over time, she built a mental catalogue of male behavior, storing away details that could later be used to her advantage. While others in her world were consumed or discarded, Theodora was quietly gathering weapons of the mind. This training ground would make her the deadliest manipulator the empire had ever seen. Theodora's life shifted when a provincial governor named Hippodrome took notice of her. To the outside world, it appeared to be a rescue, a powerful man lifting a young actress out of the brothel and giving her a place in his household. As his concubine, she gained access to fine clothes, servants, and the luxury of travel. Yet behind the glitter, her position was still that of property. She was expected to obey, to entertain, and to remain silent. But Theodora had already learned too much about power to stay passive. In Hippodrome's service, she began to test her influence, dropping remarks that shaped his opinions, guiding his anger toward rivals, and using charm to redirect decisions. For the first time, she saw how personal manipulation could touch matters of governance. This experiment, however, did not remain hidden. When Hippodrome discovered her influence, his rage ended her luxury, and sent her back to survival with new, sharper weapons. Cast out from Hippodrome's household, Theodora returned to the only trade left open to her. She moved through ports and ships across the Mediterranean, selling herself to survive, but now every encounter carried a second purpose. Clients became more than sources of money. They became sources of information. She listened to sailors, merchants, and officials, collecting details that could later be turned into favors or leverage. Unlike the helpless child once paraded in the Hippodrome, she was shaping her own path through calculated use of the same system that had once enslaved her. During these years, she also embraced Monophysite Christianity, a faith considered heretical by Constantinople's elite but powerful among marginalized communities. This gave her a new network of allies and an identity outside the circus world. Religion became both shield and stepping stone, protecting her from some dangers while giving her a moral voice that others respected. But even religion became strategy, and in Antioch, whispers began of a woman Justinian couldn't stop asking about. When Theodora finally entered the orbit of Justinian, the heir to the imperial throne, she treated the encounter as the ultimate test of everything she had learned. She did not rely only on beauty or charm, but on precise control of tone, gesture, and conversation. Every word was calculated to appeal to his insecurities and ambitions. Justinian, a man known for discipline and strict devotion to law, found himself captivated beyond reason. Unlike others in court, Theodora never flattered blindly. She questioned, teased, and positioned herself as the only one unafraid to expose his weaknesses. Soon he could not imagine ruling without her counsel. But one obstacle stood in their way. Roman law strictly forbade marriage to actresses, branding them as forever dishonored. For Justinian to make her empress, the law itself would need to change, a challenge that threatened scandal across the empire. And standing between her and the throne was one woman, the empress herself. Euphemia, the wife of Emperor Justin and a former slave herself, understood the weight of reputation in the imperial court. Having risen from bondage to dignity, she despised the idea that an ex-actress like Theodora could sit beside her nephew Justinian as empress. To Euphemia, this was not only disgraceful but dangerous, as it threatened to undo the fragile respect she had built for her own past. Their conflict was never open shouting, but icy refusals, blocked petitions, and deliberate humiliation. For Theodora, who had survived on cunning since childhood, this resistance was unacceptable. Then suddenly Euphemia fell ill and died. Whispers spread quickly. Some claimed it was natural, others believed poison had played its part. Theodora, after all, had grown up in the brothel world, where herbs and potions were tools as common as paint or costume. Whether true or not, suspicion lingered. With Euphemia gone, nothing stopped Justinian from changing the law for her. Theodora's marriage to Justinian marked one of the most shocking reversals in imperial history. A woman once branded as a prostitute was now crowned Empress of Byzantium. Legitimized by a special change in law, she moved from the stage of the Hippodrome to the throne of the empire. But her greatest test came almost immediately. In 532, the Nika revolt erupted, with tens of thousands rioting in the streets and filling the Hippodrome, demanding Justinian's removal. The palace shook with panic as fires spread across Constantinople. Justinian's advisors begged him to flee, arguing that survival was worth more than honor. In that moment of hesitation, Theodora stood firm. She reminded them that all who are born must die, but an empress should never abandon her crown. Her words cut through fear. Purple makes the best shroud. The speech stiffened Justinian's resolve and changed the course of the revolt. What followed was not escape, but slaughter. The massacre that followed turned the same arena of her childhood abuse into her deadliest weapon. The revolt reached its climax when Justinian's generals, Belisarius and Mundus, sealed the exits of the Hippodrome. Tens of thousands of rebels, who only hours before had shouted for a new emperor, now found themselves trapped inside the same arena where Theodora had once been paraded as a child performer. The order was given, and the slaughter began. Soldiers moved in waves, cutting down men without pause, until the ground was slick with blood. Chroniclers record that nearly 30,000 people were killed in a single day, an event so brutal it reshaped the balance of power in the empire. For Theodora, the symbolism could not have been clearer. The stage where she had once endured degradation was now the theater of her triumph, where humiliation was avenged with mass death. The very arena that had normalized her exploitation had become the graveyard of those who threatened her crown. But her revenge didn't stop with rebels. It extended to popes, queens, and prefects who underestimated her. As empress, Theodora did not limit herself to ceremony or charity. She built a parallel government that operated in shadows. Using eunuchs, servants, and women often ignored by officials, she wove a network of spies and informants that reached across provinces and even into the papacy. Enemies who mocked or opposed her rarely lasted long. Pope Silverius was deposed and exiled under her pressure, Queen Amalasuntha of the Ostrogoths was eliminated, and John the Cappadocian, the empire's most corrupt prefect, was trapped and disgraced through schemes she directed. Each move echoed the psychological lessons she had absorbed as a child, finding shame, exploiting weakness, and turning secrets into weapons. What she once practiced in back rooms of the Hippodrome she now applied on the grand stage of empire. Her enemies saw an empress. In truth, they faced a strategist who had spent her life studying the art of control. Yet the same woman who destroyed enemies also rewrote the law books of Rome itself. Once secure on the throne, Theodora began reshaping the very laws that had once condemned her. In Justinian's great legal code, her voice is unmistakable. She pushed for anti-trafficking reforms that placed strict controls on brothels and allowed many women forced into prostitution to be freed. Rape, once minimized as a minor offense, now carried harsher punishments, and women were granted greater rights to divorce abusive husbands. These measures were radical for the 6th century, giving legal recognition to the suffering of those who had been invisible under earlier systems. Yet Theodora's reforms were not only about mercy, they were also about control. By regulating sexuality and marriage under imperial law, she extended her authority into the most private aspects of life. The same woman who had learned power through exploitation now dictated the terms of intimacy and survival for an empire. Her laws became the skeleton of Western legal systems. But at what human cost? Theodora's life ended in 548 CE, most likely from cancer, while still in her mid-40s. Her death struck Justinian with a blow he never recovered from. Despite his power and long reign, he never remarried, a rare act for an emperor who needed heirs. In Ravenna, her mosaics were set in glittering glass, depicting her not as the broken child of the Hippodrome but as a queen draped in gold, haloed like a saint, towering above courtiers. The images fixed her in memory as larger than life, a woman whose presence outlasted scandal and fear alike. Yet behind the splendor lay a darker truth. Her childhood exploitation had forged a ruler both victim and predator, whose strength was inseparable from the traumas that shaped her. She was revered as a saint by some, reviled as a monster by others, and remembered always as a force that bent history to her will. Her story asks a haunting question: do barbaric practices only destroy, or can they also create monsters who reshape history itself?